First of all, I'd like to apologise for the delay at the beginning when I arrived some 15 minutes late. There's also a performance tonight, which I hope you come to. So I was doing a few things like multitasking and making sure that everything was going to work with the performance as well as this presentation. I wouldn't really, this is not so much a paper or anything, it's just a number of thoughts based on my experience of working in radio from the time I was a student in the UK to working in radio today in Cyprus and teaching radio for a number of years at the university and loving radio from when I was about 10 years old. So it's really a number of thoughts. I've got a lot of issues with the word diversity as well, following on from what you just said. And I remember when it was called equal opportunities, and before that it was called multiculturalism, and before that it was probably called something else when I was about 10 years old in England, when we was called foreigners. I just have to deal with the word, as much as I think it's a problematic word and ideologically loaded, just like I think about equal opportunities, multiculturalism, etc. But when we think of diversity, with respect to many things, artistic and cultural, we always think of variety, heterogeneity, respect and tolerance of difference, understanding, compassion for difference, awareness of different situations, different communities, groups of people, their different experiences. And this is very prevalent in the media, of course, and of course, radio being an important part of the media, and a medium that's going through immense transformation, largely due to digitization and the internet, but I'll come on to that later. Radio has been in existence for the best part of 100 years. Depending on what textbook you read, you'll be told where radio began. A lot of American textbooks will tell you it was someone in their garage in 1912. Someone else will tell you it was Marconi. Someone else will tell you it was the BBC. Someone else will tell you it was in France. Every country has got its history about who made the first radio broadcast or what was the first commercial broadcast. And teaching in this medium of radio, you always have to be sensitive to these different stories, because I remember when I first started teaching historical aspects of radio, a lot of students couldn't relate to it because all I was talking about was some American guy in his garage in 1912, And what they wanted to find out was, when was CYBC created, How many radio stations are there in Cyprus? So every different country's got its own story in terms of radio. But generally speaking, it's widely accepted that it was established as a medium 100 years ago. And it's a medium that can educate, it can influence public opinion, it can entertain through sending messages. It's an aesthetic thing. It's something that we just put on when we're driving, etc., etc. And it means different things to different people. But from about the 1920s, some very smart person in the United States, I'm presuming that everyone will agree with this part of it, said, I've discovered that every time I play certain types of music, I get more letters, because you didn't have phone calls or anything like that. You had letters coming in, and these were songs that were being requested. So these were the real boom years for radio in the 1920s after the First World War. And really, it led to the amazing discovery that radio is a very commercial media. And this all has to do with the airplay cycle, which is basically the presenter in a radio broadcast has got an engagement, a connection with the audience. And by taking the request from post, which was usually a week later, when he went back on the air, he would play the songs that were requested. And in playing these songs, the person who had the record shop suddenly discovered that more people were buying them. And also more people were actually buying record players. So the companies that were making the record players started to strike deals with radio stations. And also the radio sets, in terms of popularity, went up, in terms of consumerism. More people engaged with the media. So it became very apparent that the more you played something, the more people would go out and buy it. It's a very simple marketing tool. Of course, you can take this to its crude extreme, which did happen and still happens even in Cyprus, and I've experienced this myself as an artist. Not that I've ever paid someone to play my songs, but I've been asked, how much are you willing to pay? And of course I didn't play along with the system. But payola is actually legal in many countries around the world, although it's very common still. So we have a song simply to play my song, as I showed before many times, I pay money. And in paying money, power play means on rotation, so that song will be played many times. And in being played many times, we can manufacture a hit, and through something that Adorno calls repetitious quotation listening. In other words, we hear the melody line, say 20 times a day on the radio, we're obviously going to go out and buy it. You know, it's quite a simple thing. So crudely speaking, this was also discovered that the more payola we have, the happier people are, especially record labels. And, you know, in that order, the radio station's happy, the record label is happy, the publisher's happy, and some little artist might get 3% of all that money. So payola is a very common thing. The other thing that we have in radio is, before I get to formats, is we have airplay playlists. And this happens in many stations, commercial stations, even in Cyprus. There's an A list, which could be, say, like, for instance, 10 plays a day, the same song. There's a B list, which could be 5 plays a day. And there's a C list, which could be 1 play a day. And there's the D list, which basically means you never get played. You always stay on the shelf or on the hard drive that everyone's forgotten. So Hadjimichael releases a song. I'm not disrespecting him. I think he's a great artist. Hadjimichael releases a song. He's guaranteed that he's going to get 10 plays a day on 200 radio stations around the UK. And that immediately means, if we look at that crew the model before, the more play you get, the more you sell. So this is, you know, playlisting and people being told what to play is a very common practice in radio. And now with digitization and computers and everything, we don't even need to put the faders up and down. We don't even need to put the microphone on and off either. We can just press click. And we have our playlist playing for 35 minutes with the adverts. And all we do occasionally is just put the fader up to remind people that someone is actually presenting a radio show. And many radio stations operate like this. In other words, there's somebody who says what songs you're going to play, which I've always found a bit of a mystery, because I've been in radio because I tend to play songs that other people don't play. So radio for me has always been a medium for representing things that are not really represented fairly. The other thing I wanted to briefly talk about is format, because format is an important part of radio as a medium, because radio is the most formatted media in terms of the media landscape. After radio, I'd say TV is very formatted. But radio stations are formatted largely by their content. They're formatted into generally, the big format is music, and probably in the USA again, there's probably about 200 different radio formats at the moment: country, MOR, middle of the road, hit radio, etc., etc. And then you have talk format, you have sports format, you have news format. Talk format is usually people phoning up and debating endlessly for hours about various things. And formats are also very good marketing tools because they are used to attract audiences and attract advertisers. And so the first thing somebody in a radio station will say, well, what is your target audience? You know, Elizabeth wants to do a show on my station. She'll come to me and I'll say, what is your target audience? And she'll probably say, what do you mean? You know, I say, well, imagine the people that are going to listen to you. You know, and most people, when you say that to them, they freeze because they don't think along those lines. You know, it's also a bit of a myth because it presumes we're all the same. You know, all the people that are listening to this station are the same. But most radio stations are like that because they're based on these different types of music, different types of talk radio, sports radio, etc. So somebody who wants to listen to classical music, say, he's not going to be listening to a station like BFPS because it hasn't got that format. Formats are also problematic, however, because the audience is very diverse. It always has been diverse. And popular music, this very amorphous thing, I'm not using the word as in pop music, but popular music, everybody engages in it, I think, as consumers and creators. A popular song for me is a song that somebody will write because they want somebody to listen to it, or they want somebody to buy it. I don't mean pop music like manufactured music. I'm going to make millions, I'm going to sell millions of songs. I mean Somebody even doing a concert in front of 20 people is engaging in a form of communication in popular music. And because it's got different scenes, different musical scenes, it appeals to different people in different ways. Then we also have the organisational side of radio, which applies more or less universally around the world. Generally speaking, there's three types of institutionalised radio. There's state public, which is there to serve the public, and this is often funded by the state. In the UK, the BBC is funded through the Foreign Office for a large period of time. I'm not sure if that relationship still exists. And the BBC was a very colonial institution when the British Empire existed, because it was there to sort of educate the people in the colonies, especially the World Service, about the joy of being a British citizen in the colonies. Then we have the private sector, and all these radio stations, which is the vast majority of radio stations, are in a dog-eat-dog kind of world, which is basically profit-orientated and is run as a business. The third area, which is a bit like, Gaddafi's third way or something, is community radio, which is a very problematic term, really, because it depends what community you're talking about. But community is usually non-for-profit, sometimes voluntary, sometimes some people do get paid for managing community stations. But it caters for specific kinds of music, and this could be based on ethnic or cultural communities. It could also be a community radio station with a very small village kind of audience, say a parish or something like that. And there are many examples of community radio which are also privately run, so they are run for profit. And what I wanted to make clear about all this, of course, is that all these stations, to operate, have to be legit. They have to have a license. And you don't get a license easily. You have to go through a very rigorous procedure of making feasibility studies and ensuring that your infrastructure is correct, that you're employing the right amount of people, the correct qualifications, etc., and experience. Of course, the fourth area that most people don't really talk about academically is pirate radio. And this is seen as illegal because the people who operate often endangering their lives in some ways, because they're probably going to end up getting arrested eventually and being banned. But many people would still operate on pirate radio stations, which are land-based, because their music is marginalised. They feel that nobody's playing their kind of music. And this is often the case with new emerging musical forms. And a country and a place that's very known for this is Britain, and also inner city areas like London, Birmingham, Manchester. For example, in the early 1990s, there were over 300 pirate radio stations in London alone, often existing in a very high-risk kind of way, because they could be raided at any minute. And this meant a lot of these people would turn to the internet, and the internet has become a very interesting area, which I'll talk about a little bit later, because the regulation on it is not so rigid. In Cyprus, the two most dominant forms are state and private, and community radio is virtually non-existent, or if it does exist, it only exists on the internet. More recently, these kinds of projects have emerged through online citizens' media initiatives, or based around specific music, such as the Cyprus Dub Community Radio. More will also emerge because the emerging e-radio format, where anybody can sit in front of a webcam and be on YouTube and talk to anyone anywhere in the world. It's not streaming, it's e-radio, will become very common. And there are a lot of people who sit there in front of a screen and play songs, and they think that's radio. It's called e-radio. I find it a bit mundane, because radio for me has always been about sound. It's got nothing to do with what you look like and how you're sitting there grooving to the music. But this is something that everybody can do if they want. I think we also have to take into account music policy. And generally, the same applies to Turkish Cypriots, I think, but with different categorizations. I'm only going to refer to Greek Cypriots, because that's my main experience of radio. But from Turkish Cypriots, I know it's a very similar thing. who take Cyprus, who work in the medium of radio. So the general division in Cyprus over the last 50 years that radio has been in existence, first in its very public, state-run form, CYBC, and then after the early 1990s with the emergence of private radio under the Vasiliou government, which was one of his best initiatives at that time. The dominant popular music form has been labelled Greek. So we play Greek music, and then anything else is apologies for the spelling mistake, is lumped into this very dubious categorization of kseni musiki, foreign music. And foreign music, this has created a kind of superiority complex, meaning Greek music is above foreign music, even though in a worldwide sense, in terms of sales, relatively speaking, Greek music is quite non-significant. And in the UK, it will probably be the opposite way around. Greek music will be seen as foreign music. And in many other countries around the world. Not that that's correct either. This obviously stifles difference and leaves very little room for anyone playing non-Greek music to be on the air. And from my wealthy experience of being on the air, this has always meant that any radio show I've done has been on 9 till 12 at night, or even after that in the graveyard shift, which is what we call after midnight. And this means that difference institutionally on all the radio formats has been excluded because the main format is Greek chart music or English pop music in some cases on some stations. There are some exceptions, of course, to this. There are some exceptions because I think what happens is when radio becomes so stale, a lot of people turn to the clubs or turn to their own music scene to find what they're looking for. A lot of people also turn to the internet now to find what they're looking for. I don't listen to Cypriot stations. I listen to stations from all parts of the world. And different music scenes have existed in Cyprus for some time, at least since the early 1980s. And these really have developed a life of their own, albeit very dubious, as Elizabeth rightly pointed out. And I think that should be called Cypro, Banana Republic, personally. And self-sustaining networks of their own, like heavy metal, electronic dance music, reggae, hip-hop, and so on and so forth. And these have existed in parallel on both sides of the Green Line. There are exceptions as DJs, and Robert Gamasa is probably one of the most popular exceptions to the rule of what a DJ is in Cyprus. He's been broadcasting rock music on CYBC, and previous to that on Super FM, for the best part of about 20 years, probably more. And I think one reason why heavy metal music is so popular is there's always been this guy on radio playing it. Yeah. And also I've contributed to this in some smaller way through various reggae shows that I've been doing on Radio Prodon, CYBC, Radio Napa, and more recently Astra Radio. But on all these stations, I'd like to stress that I was always labelled as kseni musiki, foreign music. The radio show, despite being called out on national, was never called the way it was, a show playing reggae music. In terms of diversity and all of this, of course, different communities have always existed in Cyprus. And this difference has seldom been reflected via radio, with the exception of some very stale ethnic programming on CYBC2 that serves the Armenian, Turkish Cypriot, and I think they're the main communities in terms of language. But it's the same songs every week, more or less. There's very, very little room for anything different on those programs. And that channel is also institutionalized. It's actually in the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus. So nobody can change that. No government could ever change that. They have to change the Constitution. And what I find ironic about all this is when Cypriots lived abroad, as Elizabeth said earlier on, we are a society historically of emigration. More recently, although immigrants have always existed in Cyprus, we've just never noticed them. More recently, since Cyprus joined the EU, became more of an immigrant culture society. But when we go back to this period of emigration from the 1920s onwards, but the biggest waves were related to the political and economic situation in Cyprus in the 50s and 60s and 70s, Cypriots who went abroad wanted to form their own type of media, newspapers, radio, TV. London Greek Radio is a very good example of this. It emerged as from a pirate station, becoming a community radio station with a very dubious private kind of existence. I know it sounds a bit confusing, but it runs as a business. It doesn't really run as a community station, in my opinion. Could we envisage the same thing, for example, for Sri Lankans, Bulgarians, or Vietnamese in Cyprus having their own radio station, like they do in other countries for various communities? Germany being a very good example, which has had multicultural diversity radio programming for at least 20, 30 years. This cannot happen without funding and without the proper infrastructure and the proper policies to integrate people, which are non-existent as far as the radio authority of the Republic of Cyprus is concerned. Mainly because when you apply for a license, you apply for it as a business. There's no community media or community radio legislation. But we do have Russian radio stations. We have several at the moment. Russians represent, with no disrespect to Russians, I think they're a very organized community. They represent roughly about 9,000 people in the Republic of Cyprus, which is roughly 4% of the total population. And there are several radio stations in Limassol. I think one reason why they exist is because the Russian community is fairly well assimilated in Cyprus, very well connected, and Marios is doing the money sign, yeah.
Yeah, and they don't have to leave after 4 years.
And also the status of Russians in Cyprus is very different from third country nationals. The other challenge for the future is the internet, and web-based citizens media will become much more prevalent. Although this is a form of narrowcasting, let's not be deluded that we're actually broadcasting by sitting in front of a webcam and talking to 5 people around the world. It's not broadcasting to millions of people. But it is significant because what's happening is radio is becoming a lot more, it's a bit like micro-blogging, you know, micro-radio is something that existed for a very long time in many countries throughout the world. And pirate radio started with that kind of philosophy. And when you think about it, we're spending much more time now checking our mobile phones instead of reading newspapers. And also we're spending much more time on the internet, surfing through various things than watching television or listening to the radio. In fact, the only time we listen to the radio generally is driving around in the car, for most people. And where there is an audience for a certain type of music, for a specific sound, for a specific culture, language, aesthetics are very important for me. There will always be people who go against the homogenized, mainstream, playlisted, payola type structures of radio stations that exist throughout the world. There will always be people who dare to be different, and I'd like to finish with a quotation from the late great John Peel, who once said in the 1970s, "The pile of records I ploughed through this week is really drab, awful formula disco stuff, third-rate drivel. Making my list up today, I kept thinking, but this isn't any good." Thank you.